Welcome to Stories to Fall Asleep With. Just set me playing, relax, and drift off. Maybe you'll dream about the story I'm telling you. Subscribe, and you'll end up with a library of stories to choose from. Comment to let me know where in the world you are. I love knowing that trivia. Enough rambling, on with the story. I know you'll love it, even if you don't reach the end. Part 1, This World. Be patient, for the world is broad and wide. Section 1, Of the Nature of Flatland. I call our world Flatland, not because we call it so, but to make its nature clearer to you, my happy readers, who are privileged to live in space. Imagine a vast sheet of paper on which straight lines, triangles, squares, pentagons, hexagons, and other figures, instead of remaining fixed in their places, move freely about, on or in the surface, but without the power of rising above or sinking below it, very much like shadows, only hard and with luminous edges, and you will then have a pretty correct notion of my country and countrymen. Alas, a few years ago I should have said my universe, but now my mind has been opened to higher views of things. In such a country, you will perceive at once that it is impossible that there should be anything of what you call a solid kind. But I dare say you will suppose that we could at least distinguish by sight the triangles, squares, and other figures, moving about as I have described them. On the contrary, we could see nothing of the kind, not at least so as to distinguish one figure from another. Nothing was visible, nor could be visible to us except straight lines, and the necessity of this I will speedily demonstrate. Place a penny on the middle of one of your tables in space, and leaning over it, look down upon it. It will appear a circle. But now, drawing back to the edge of the table, gradually lower your eye, thus bringing yourself more and more into the condition of the inhabitants of Flatland, and you will find the penny becoming more and more oval to your view, and at last when you have placed your eye exactly on the edge of the table, so that you are, as it were, actually a Flatlander, the penny will then have ceased to appear oval at all, and will have become, so far as you can see, a straight line. The same thing would happen if you were to treat in the same way a triangle, or square, or any other figure cut out of pasteboard. As soon as you look at it with your eye on the edge on the table, you will find that it ceases to appear to you a figure, and that it becomes in appearance a straight line. Take, for example, an equilateral triangle, who represents with us a tradesman of the respectable class. Fig 1 represents the tradesman as you would see him while you were bending over him from above. Figs 2 and 3 represent the tradesman as you would see him if your eye were close to the level, or all but on the level of the table. And if your eye were quite on the level of the table, and that is how we see him in Flatland, you would see nothing but a straight line. When I was in Spaceland, I heard that your sailors have very similar experiences while they traverse your seas and discern some distant island or coast lying on the horizon. The far-off land may have bays, forelands, angles in and out to any number and extent, yet at a distance you see none of these, unless indeed your sun shines bright upon them, revealing the projections and retirements by means of light and shade. Nothing but a gray unbroken line upon the water. Well, that is just what we see when one of our triangular or other acquaintances comes toward us in Flatland. As there is neither sun with us, nor any light of such a kind as to make shadows, we have none of the helps to the sight that you have in Spaceland. If our friend comes closer to us, we see his line becomes larger. If he leaves us, it becomes smaller. But still, he looks like a straight line. Be he a triangle, square, pentagon, hexagon, circle, what you will, a straight line he looks, and nothing else. You may perhaps ask how under these disadvantageous circumstances we are able to distinguish our friends from one another, but the answer to this very natural question will be more fitly and easily given when I come to describe the inhabitants of Flatland. For the present, let me defer this subject and say a word or two about the climate and houses in our country. Section 2. Of the climate and houses in Flatland, as with you, so also with us, there are 4 points of the compass, north, south, east, and west. There being no sun nor other heavenly bodies, it is impossible for us to determine the north in the usual way, but we have a method of our own. By a law of nature with us there is a constant attraction to the south, and, although in temperate climates this is very slight, so that even a woman in reasonable health can journey several furlongs northward without much difficulty, yet the hampering effect of the southward attraction is quite sufficient to serve as a compass in most parts of our earth. Moreover, the rain, which falls at stated intervals, coming always from the north, is an additional assistance. And in the towns we have the guidance of the houses, which of course have their side walls running for the most part north and south, so that the roofs may keep off the rain from the north. In the country, where there are no houses, the trunks of the trees serve as some sort of guide. Altogether, we have not so much difficulty as might be expected in determining our bearings. Yet in our more temperate regions, in which the southward attraction is hardly felt, walking sometimes in a perfectly desolate plain where there have been no houses nor trees to guide me, I have been occasionally compelled to remain stationary for hours together, waiting till the rain came before continuing my journey. On the weak and aged, and especially on delicate females, the force of attraction tells much more heavily than on the robust of the male sex, so that it is a point of breeding, if you meet a lady in the street, always to give her the north side of the way. By no means an easy thing to do always at short notice when you are in rude health and in a climate where it is difficult to tell your north from your south. Windows there are none in our houses, for the light comes to us alike in our homes and out of them, by day and by night, equally at all times and in all places, whence we know not. It was in old days with our learned men an interesting and oft investigated question, what is the origin of light? And the solution of it has been repeatedly attempted, with no other result than to crowd our lunatic asylums with the would-be solvers. Hence, after fruitless attempts to suppress such investigations indirectly by making them liable to a heavy tax, the legislature, in comparatively recent times, absolutely prohibited them. I alone in Flatland, know now only too well the true solution of this mysterious problem. But my knowledge cannot be made intelligible to a single one of my countrymen, and I am mocked at the sole possessor of the truths of space and of the theory of the introduction of light from the world of three dimensions, as if I were the maddest of the mad. But a truce to these painful digressions. Let me return to our houses. The most common form for the construction of a house is five-sided or pentagonal, as in the annexed figure. The two northern sides, constitute the roof, and for the way, most part have no doors. On the east is a small door for the women. On the west, a much larger one for the men. The south side or floor is usually doorless. Square and triangular houses are not allowed, and for this reason. The angles of a square, and still more those of an equilateral triangle, being much more pointed than those of a pentagon, and the lines of inanimate objects, such as houses, being dimmer than the lines of men and women, it follows that there is no little danger lest the points of a square or triangular house residence might do serious injury to an inconsiderate or perhaps absent-minded traveler, suddenly therefore running against them. And as early as the 11th century of our era, triangular houses were universally forbidden by law, the only exceptions being fortifications, powder magazines, barracks, and other state buildings, which it is not desirable that the general public should approach without circumspection. At this period, square houses were still everywhere permitted, though discouraged by a special tax. But about 3 centuries afterwards, the law decided that in all towns containing a population above 10,000, the angle of a pentagon was the smallest house angle that could be allowed consistently with the public safety. The good sense of the community has seconded the efforts of the legislature, and now, even in the country, the pentagonal construction has superseded every other. It is only now and then in some very remote and backward agricultural district that an antiquarian may still discover a square house. Section 3. Concerning the inhabitants of Flatland. The greatest length or breadth of a full-grown inhabitant of Flatland may be estimated at about 11 of your inches. 12 inches may be regarded as a maximum. Our women are straight lines. Our soldiers and lowest classes of workmen are triangles with 2 equal sides, each about 11 inches long, and a base or third side so short, often not exceeding half an inch, that they form at their vertices a very sharp and formidable angle. Indeed, when their bases are of the most degraded type, not more than the 1/8 part of an inch in size, they can hardly be distinguished from straight lines or women. So extremely pointed are their vertices. With us, as with you, these triangles are distinguished from others by being called isosceles. And by this name, I shall refer to them in the following pages. Our middle class consists of equilateral or equal-sided triangles. Our professional men and gentlemen are squares, to which class I myself belong, and five-sided figures or pentagons. Next above these come the nobility, of whom there are several degrees, beginning at six-sided figures, or hexagons, and from thence rising in the number of their sides till they receive the honorable title of polygonal, or many-sided. Finally, when the number of the sides becomes so numerous and the sides themselves so small that the figure cannot be distinguished from a circle, he is included in the circular or priestly order, and this is the highest class of all. It is a law of nature with us that a male child shall have one more side than his father, so that each generation shall rise, as a rule, one step in the scale of development and nobility. Thus, the son of a square is a pentagon, the son of a pentagon a hexagon, and so on. But this rule applies not always to the tradesmen, and still less often to the soldiers and to the workmen, who indeed can hardly be said to deserve the name of human figures, since they have not all their sides equal. With them, therefore, the law of nature does not hold, and the son of an isosceles, i.e., a triangle with two sides equal, remains isosceles still. Nevertheless, all hope is not shut out, even from the isosceles, that his posterity may ultimately rise above his degraded condition. For, after a long series of military successes, or diligent and skillful labors, it is generally found that the more intelligent among the artisan and soldier classes manifest a slight increase of their third side or base, and a shrinkage of the two other sides. Intermarriages, arranged by the priests, between the sons and daughters of these more intellectual members of the lower classes, generally result in an offspring approximating still more to the type of the equal-sided triangle. Rarely, in proportion to the vast numbers of isosceles births, is a genuine and certifiable equal-sided triangle produced from isosceles parents. Note, what need of a certificate? A Spaceland critic may ask, is not the procreation of a square son a certificate from nature herself, proving the equal-sidedness of the father? I reply that no lady of any position will marry an uncertified triangle. Square offspring has sometimes resulted from a slightly irregular triangle, but in almost every such case the irregularity of the first generation is visited on the third, which either fails to attain the pentagonal rank or relapses to the triangular. Such a birth requires, as its antecedents, not only a series of carefully arranged intermarriages, but also a long-continued exercise of frugality and self-control on the part of the would-be ancestors of the coming equilateral, and a patient, systematic, and continuous development of the isosceles intellect through many generations. The birth of a true equilateral triangle from isosceles parents is the subject of rejoicing in our country for many furlongs around. After a strict examination conducted by the Sanitary and Social Board, the infant, if certified as regular, is with solemn ceremonial admitted into the class of equilaterals. He is then immediately taken from his proud yet sorrowing parents and adopted by some childless equilateral, who is bound by oath never to permit the child henceforth to enter his former home, or so much as to look upon his relations again, for fear lest the freshly developed organism may, by force of unconscious imitation, fall back again into his hereditary level. The occasional emergence of an equilateral from the ranks of his serf-born ancestors is welcomed, not only by the poor serfs themselves, as a gleam of light and hope shed upon the monotonous squalor of their existence, but also by the aristocracy at large. For all the higher classes are well aware that these rare phenomena, while they do little or nothing to vulgarize their own privileges, serve as a most useful barrier against revolution from below. Had the acute-angled rabble been all, without exception, absolutely destitute of hope and of ambition, they might have found leaders in some of their many seditious outbreaks, so able as to render their superior numbers and strength too much even for the wisdom of the circles. But a wise ordinance of nature has decreed that, in proportion as the working classes increase in intelligence, knowledge, and all virtue, in that same proportion their acute angle, which makes them physically terrible, shall increase also and approximate to the comparatively harmless angle of the equilateral triangle. Thus, in the most brutal and formidable of the soldier class, creatures almost on a level with women in their lack of intelligence, it is found that, as they wax in the mental ability necessary to employ their tremendous penetrating power to advantage, so do they wane in the power of penetration itself. How admirable is this law of compensation! And how perfect a proof of the natural fitness and, I may almost say, the divine origin of the aristocratic constitution of the states in Flatland. By a judicious use of this law of nature, the polygons and circles are almost always able to stifle sedition in its very cradle, taking advantage of the irrepressible and boundless hopefulness of the human mind. Art also comes to the aid of law and order. It is generally found possible by a little artificial compression or expansion on the part of the state physicians to make some of the more intelligent leaders of a rebellion perfectly regular, and to admit them at once into the privileged classes. A much larger number, who are still below the standard, allured by the prospect of being ultimately ennobled, are induced to enter the state hospitals, where they are kept in honorable confinement for life. One or two alone of the more obstinate, foolish, and hopelessly irregular are led to execution. Then the wretched rabble of the isosceles, planless and leaderless, are either transfixed without resistance by the small body of their brethren whom the chief circle keeps in pay for emergencies of this kind, or else more often, by means of jealousies and suspicions skillfully fomented among them by the circular party, they are stirred to mutual warfare and perish by one another's angles. No less than 120 rebellions are recorded in our annals, besides minor outbreaks numbered at 235, and they have all ended thus. Section 4. Concerning the women, if our highly pointed triangles of the soldier class are formidable, it may be readily inferred that far more formidable are our women, for if a soldier is a wedge, a woman is a needle, being, so to speak, all point, at least at the two extremities. Add to this the power of making herself practically invisible at will, and you will perceive that a female, in Flatland, is a creature by no means to be trifled with. But here, perhaps, some of my younger readers may ask how a woman in Flatland can make herself invisible. This ought, I think, to be apparent without any explanation. However, a few words will make it clear to the most unreflecting. Place a needle on a table. Then, with your eye on the level of the table, look at it sideways, and you see the whole length of it. But look at it endways, and you see nothing but a point. It has become practically invisible. Just so is it with one of our women. When her side is turned towards us, we see her as a straight line. When the end containing her eye or mouth, for with us these two organs are identical, is the part that meets our eye, then we see nothing but a highly lustrous point. But when the back is presented to our view, then, being only sublustrous, and indeed almost as dim as an inanimate object, her hinder extremity serves her as a kind of invisible cap. The dangers to which we are exposed from our women must now be manifest to the meanest capacity in Spaceland. If even the angle of a respectable triangle in the middle class is not without its dangers, if to run against a working man involves a gash, if collision with an officer of the military class necessitates a serious wound, if a mere touch from the vertex of a private soldier brings with it danger of death, what can it be to run against a woman except absolute and immediate destruction? And when a woman is invisible, or visible only as a dim sublustrous point, how difficult must it be, even for the most cautious, always to avoid collision? Many are the enactments made at different times in the different states of Flatland in order to minimize this peril, and in the southern and less temperate climates where the force of gravitation is greater and human beings more liable to casual and involuntary motions, the laws concerning women are naturally much more stringent. But a general view of the code may be obtained from the following summary. 1. Every house shall have one entrance in the eastern side, for the use of females only, by which all females shall enter in a becoming and respectful manner, and not by the men's or western door. Note: when I was in Spaceland, I understood that some of your priestly circles have in the same way a separate entrance for villagers, farmers, and teachers of board schools, Spectator, September 1884, period 1255, that they may approach in a becoming and respectful manner. 2. No female shall walk in any public place without continually keeping up her peace cry, under penalty of death. Any female duly certified to be suffering from St. Vitus's dance fits, chronic cold accompanied by violent sneezing, or any disease necessitating involuntary motions, shall be instantly destroyed. In some of the states there is an additional law forbidding females, under penalty of death, from walking or standing in any public place without moving their backs constantly from right to left, so as to indicate their presence to those behind them. Others oblige a woman, when traveling, to be followed by one of her sons, or servants, or by her husband. Others confine women altogether to their houses, except during the religious festivals. But it has been found by the wisest of our circles or statesmen that the multiplication of restrictions on females tends not only to the debilitation and diminution of the race, but also to the increase of domestic murders to such an extent that a state loses more than it gains by a too prohibitive code. For whenever the temper of the women is thus exasperated by confinement at home or hampering regulations abroad, they are apt to vent their spleen upon their husbands and children. And in the less temperate climates, the whole male population of a village has been sometimes destroyed in 1 or 2 hours of simultaneous female outbreak. Hence the 3 laws mentioned above suffice for the better regulated states, and may be accepted as a rough exemplification of our female code. After all, our principal safeguard is found, not in legislature, but in the interests of the women themselves. For although they can inflict instantaneous death by a retrograde movement, yet unless they can at once disengage their stinging extremity from the struggling body of their victim, their own frail bodies are liable to be shattered. The power of fashion is also on our side. I pointed out that in some less civilized states, no female is suffered to stand in any public place without swaying her back from right to left. This practice has been universal among ladies of any pretensions to breeding in all well-governed states, as far back as the memory of figures can reach. It is considered a disgrace to any state that legislation should have to enforce what ought to be, and is in every respectable female, a natural instinct, the rhythmical and, if I may so say, well-modulated undulation of the back in our ladies. Of circular rank is envied and imitated by the wife of a common equilateral, who can achieve nothing beyond a mere monotonous swing, like the ticking of a pendulum. And the regular tick of the equilateral is no less admired and copied by the wife of the progressive and aspiring isosceles, in the females of whose family no back motion of any kind has become as yet a necessity of life. Hence, in every family of position and consideration, back motion is as prevalent as time itself, and the husbands and sons in these households enjoy immunity at least from invisible attacks. Not that it must be for a moment supposed that our women are destitute of affection. But unfortunately, the passion of the moment predominates in the frail sex over every other consideration. This is, of course, a necessity arising from their unfortunate conformation. For as they have no pretensions to an angle, being inferior, in this respect to the very lowest of the isosceles, they are consequently wholly devoid of brain power, and have neither reflection, judgment, nor forethought, and hardly any memory. Hence, in their fits of fury, they remember no claims and recognize no distinctions. I have actually known a case where a woman has exterminated her whole household, and half an hour afterwards, when her rage was over and the fragments swept away, has asked what has become of her husband and her children. Obviously, then, a woman is not to be irritated as long as she is in a position where she can turn round. When you have them in their apartments, which are constructed with a view to denying them that power, you can say and do what you like, for they are then wholly impotent for mischief, and will not remember a few minutes hence the incident for which they may be at this moment threatening you with death, nor the promises which you may have found it necessary to make in order to pacify their fury. On the whole, we get on pretty smoothly in our domestic relations, except in the lower strata of the military classes. There the want of tact and discretion on the part of the husbands produces at times indescribable disasters. Relying too much on the offensive weapons of their acute angles instead of the defensive organs of good sense and seasonable simulation, These reckless creatures too often neglect the prescribed construction of the women's apartments, or irritate their wives by ill-advised expressions out of doors, which they refuse immediately to retract. Moreover, a blunt and stolid regard for literal truth indisposes them to make those lavish promises by which the more judicious circle can in a moment pacify his consort. The result is massacre, not, however, without its advantages, as it eliminates the more brutal and troublesome of the isosceles, and by many of our circles the destructiveness of the thinner sex is regarded as one among many providential arrangements for suppressing redundant population and nipping revolution in the bud. Yet even in our best regulated and most approximately circular families, I cannot say that the ideal of family life is so high as with you in Spaceland. There is peace insofar as the absence of slaughter may be called by that name, but there is necessarily little harmony of tastes or pursuits, and the cautious wisdom of the circles has ensured safety at the cost of domestic comfort. In every circular or polygonal household, it has been a habit from time immemorial, and now has become a kind of instinct among the women of our higher classes, that the mothers and daughters should constantly keep their eyes and mouths towards their husband and his male friends. And for a lady in a family of distinction to turn her back upon her husband would be regarded as a kind of portent involving loss of status. But, as I shall soon show, this custom, though it has the advantage of safety, is not without its disadvantages. In the house of the working man or respectable tradesman, where the wife is allowed to turn her back upon her husband while pursuing her household avocations, there are at least intervals of quiet, when the wife is neither seen nor heard, except for the humming sound of the continuous peace cry. But in the homes of the upper classes there is too often no peace. There the voluble mouth and bright penetrating eye are ever directed towards the master of the household, and light itself is not more persistent than the stream of feminine discourse. The tact and skill which suffice to avert a woman's sting are unequal to the task of stopping a woman's mouth. And as the wife has absolutely nothing to say, and absolutely no constraint of wit, sense, or conscience to prevent her from saying it, not a few cynics have been found to aver that they prefer the danger of the death-dealing but inaudible sting to the safe sonorousness of a woman's other end. To my readers in Spaceland, the condition of our women may seem truly deplorable, and so indeed it is. A male of the lowest type of the isosceles may look forward to some improvement of his angle, and to the ultimate elevation of the whole of his degraded caste, but no woman can entertain such hopes for her sex. Once a woman, always a woman, is a decree of nature, and the very laws of evolution seem suspended in her disfavor. Yet at least we can admire the wise prearrangement which has ordained that, as they have no hopes, so they shall have no memory to recall, and no forethought to anticipate the miseries and humiliations which are at once a necessity of their existence and the basis of the constitution of Flatland. Section 5. Of our methods of recognizing one another, you, who are blessed with shade as well as light, you, who are gifted with two eyes, endowed with a knowledge of perspective, and charmed with the enjoyment of various colors, you, who can actually see an angle, and contemplate the complete circumference of a circle in the happy region of the three dimensions. How shall I make clear to you the extreme difficulty which we in Flatland experience in recognizing one another's configuration? Recall what I told you above. All beings in Flatland, animate or inanimate, no matter what their form, present to our view the same, or nearly the same appearance, viz., that of a straight line. How then can one be distinguished from another, where all appear the same? The answer is threefold. The first means of recognition is the sense of hearing, which with us is far more highly developed than with you, and which enables us not only to distinguish by the voice our personal friends, but even to discriminate between different classes, at least so far as concerns the three lowest orders, the equilateral, the square, and the pentagon, for of the isosceles I take no account. But as we ascend in the social scale, the process of discriminating and being discriminated by hearing increases in difficulty, partly because voices are assimilated, partly because the faculty of voice discrimination is a plebeian virtue not much developed among the aristocracy, and wherever there is any danger of imposture, we cannot trust to this method. Amongst our lowest orders, the vocal organs are developed to a degree more than correspondent with those of hearing, so that an isosceles can easily feign the voice of a polygon, and, with some training, that of a circle himself. A second method is therefore more commonly resorted to. Feeling is, among our women and lower classes, about our upper classes I shall speak presently, the principal test of recognition, at all events between strangers, and when the question is, not as to the individual, but as to the class. What therefore introduction is among the higher classes in Spaceland, that the process of feeling is with us. Permit me to ask you to feel and be felt by my friend Mr. So-and-so is still among the more old-fashioned of our country gentlemen. In districts remote from towns, the customary formula for a Flatland introduction. But in the towns, and among men of business, the words "be felt by" are omitted, and the sentence is abbreviated to, "Let me ask you to feel Mr. So-and-so." Although, it is assumed, of course, that the feeling is to be reciprocal. Among our still more modern and dashing young gentlemen, who are extremely averse to superfluous effort and supremely indifferent to the purity of their native language, the formula is still further curtailed by the use of "to feel" in a technical sense, meaning to recommend for the purposes of feeling and being felt. And at this moment, the slang of polite or fast society in the upper classes sanctions such a barbarism as, "Mr. Smith, permit me to feel Mr. Jones." Let not my reader, however, suppose that feeling is with us the tedious process that it would be with you, or that we find it necessary to feel right round all the sides of every individual before we determine the class to which he belongs. Long practice and training, begun in the schools and continued in the experience of daily life, enable us to discriminate at once by the sense of touch between the angles of an equal-sided triangle, square, and pentagon. And I need not say that the brainless vertex of an acute angled isosceles is obvious to the dullest touch. It is therefore not necessary, as a rule, to do more than feel a single angle of an individual. And this, once ascertained, tells us the class of the person whom we are addressing, unless indeed he belongs to the higher sections of the nobility. There the difficulty is much greater. Even a master of arts in our University of Wentbridge has been known to confuse a 10-sided with a 12-sided polygon, and there is hardly a doctor of science in or out of that famous university who could pretend to decide promptly and unhesitatingly between a 20-sided and a 24-sided member of the aristocracy. Those of my readers who recall the extracts I gave above from the legislative code concerning women will readily perceive that the process of introduction by contact requires some care and discretion. Otherwise, the angles might inflict on the unwary feeler irreparable injury. It is essential for the safety of the feeler that the felt should stand perfectly still. A start, a fidgety shifting of the position, yes, even a violent sneeze has been known before now to prove fatal to the incautious and to nip in the bud many a promising friendship. Especially is this true among the lower classes of the triangles. With them, the eye is situated so far from their vertex that they can scarcely take cognizance of what goes on at that extremity of their frame. They are, moreover, of a rough, coarse nature, not sensitive to the delicate touch of the highly organized polygon. What wonder then if an involuntary toss of the head has ere now deprived the state of a valuable life? I have heard that my excellent grandfather, one of the least irregular of his unhappy isosceles class, who indeed obtained, shortly before his decease, 4 out of 7 votes from the Sanitary and Social Board for passing him into the class of the equal-sided, often deplored, with a tear in his venerable eye, a miscarriage of this kind, which had occurred to his great-great-great-grandfather, a respectable working man with an angle or brain of 59 degrees 30 minutes. According to his account, my unfortunate ancestor, being afflicted with rheumatism, and in the act of being felt by a polygon, by one sudden start accidentally transfixed the great man through the diagonal, and thereby, partly in consequence of his long imprisonment and degradation, and partly because of the moral shock which pervaded the whole of my ancestor's relations, threw back our family a degree and a half in their ascent towards better things. The result was that in the next generation the family brain was registered at only 58 degrees, and not till the lapse of 5 generations was the lost ground recovered, the full 60 degrees attained, and the ascent from the isosceles finally achieved. And all this series of calamities from one little accident in the process of feeling. At this point, I think I hear some of my better educated readers exclaim, "How could you in Flatland know anything about angles and degrees or minutes?" We can see an angle because we, in the region of space, can see two straight lines inclined to one another. But you, who can see nothing but one straight line at a time, or at all events only a number of bits of straight lines all in one straight line, how can you ever discern any angle and much less register angles of different sizes? I answer that though we cannot see angles, we can infer them, and this with great precision. Our sense of touch, stimulated by necessity and developed by long training, enables us to distinguish angles far more accurately than your sense of sight, when unaided by a rule or measure of angles. Nor must I omit to explain that we have great natural helps. It is with us a law of nature that the brain of the isosceles class shall begin at half a degree, or 30 minutes, and shall increase, if it increases at all, by half a degree in every generation, until the goal of 60 degrees is reached, when the condition of serfdom is quitted, and the freeman enters the class of regulars. Consequently, nature herself supplies us with an ascending scale or alphabet of angles for half a degree up to 60 degrees, specimens of which are placed in every elementary school throughout the land, owing to occasional retrogressions, to still more frequent moral and intellectual stagnation, and to the extraordinary fecundity of the criminal and vagabond classes. There is always a vast superfluity of individuals of the half-degree and single-degree class and a fair abundance of specimens up to 10 degrees. These are absolutely destitute of civic rights, and a great number of them, not having even intelligence enough for the purposes of warfare, are devoted by the states to the service of education. Fettered immovably so as to remove all possibility of danger, they are placed in the classrooms of our infant schools, and there they are utilized by the Board of Education for the purpose of imparting to the offspring of the middle classes that tact and intelligence of which these wretched creatures themselves are utterly devoid. In some states, the specimens are occasionally fed and suffered to exist for several years, but in the more temperate and better regulated regions, it is found in the long run more advantageous for the educational interests of the young to dispense with food and to renew the specimens every month, which is about the average duration of the foodless existence of the criminal class. In the cheaper schools, what is gained by the longer existence of the specimen is lost, partly in the expenditure for food, and partly in the diminished accuracy of the angles, which are impaired after a few weeks of constant feeling. Nor must we forget to add, in enumerating the advantages of the more expensive system, that it tends, though slightly yet perceptibly, to the diminution of the redundant isosceles population, an object which every statesman in Flatland constantly keeps in view. On the whole, therefore, although I am not ignorant that, in many popularly elected school boards, there is a reaction in favor of the cheap system, as it is called, I am myself disposed to think that this is one of the many cases in which expense is the truest economy. But I must not allow questions of school board politics to divert me from my subject. Enough has been said, I trust, to show that recognition by feeling is not so tedious or indecisive a process as might have been supposed, and it is obviously more trustworthy than recognition by hearing. Still there remains, as has been pointed out above, the objection that this method is not without danger. For this reason, many in the middle and lower classes, and all without exception in the polygonal and circular orders, prefer a third method, the description of which shall be reserved for the next section. Section 6. Of recognition by sight I am about to appear very inconsistent. In previous sections I have said that all figures in Flatland present the appearance of a straight line, and it was added or implied that it is consequently impossible to distinguish by the visual organ between individuals of different classes. Yet now I am about to explain to my Spaceland critics how we are able to recognize one another by the sense of sight. If, however, the reader will take the trouble to refer to the passage in which recognition by feeling is stated to be universal, he will find this qualification among the lower classes. It is only among the higher classes and in our temperate climates that sight recognition is practiced. That this power exists in any regions and for any classes is the result of fog, which prevails during the greater part of the year in all parts, save the torrid zones. That which is with you in Spaceland, an unmixed evil, blotting out the landscape, depressing the spirits, and enfeebling the health, is by us recognized as a blessing scarcely inferior to air itself, and as the nurse of arts and parent of sciences. But let me explain my meaning, without further eulogies on this beneficent element. If fog were non-existent, all lines would appear equally and indistinguishably clear, and this is actually the case in those unhappy countries in which the atmosphere is perfectly dry and transparent. But wherever there is a rich supply of fog, objects that are at a distance, say of 3 feet, are appreciably dimmer than those at a distance of 2 feet 11 inches. And the result is that by careful and constant experimental observation of comparative dimness and clearness, we are enabled to infer with great exactness the configuration of the object observed. An instance will do more than a volume of generalities. To make my meaning clear, suppose I see 2 individuals approaching whose rank I wish to ascertain. They are, we will suppose, a merchant and a physician, or in other words, an equilateral triangle and a pentagon. How am I to distinguish them? It will be obvious to every child in Spaceland who has touched the threshold of geometrical studies that if I can bring my eye so that its glance may bisect an angle, A, of the approaching stranger, my view will lie as it were evenly between his 2 sides that are next to me, visiper, CA and AB, so that I shall contemplate the 2 impartially and both will appear of the same size. Now in the case of 1 the merchant, what shall I see? I shall see a straight line day in which the middle point, A, will be very bright because it is nearest to me, but on either side the line will shade away rapidly into dimness because the sides AC and AB recede rapidly into the fog and what appear to me as the merchant's extremities, viz. D and E, will be very dim indeed. On the other hand, in the case of 2 the physician, though I shall here also see a line, DAE, with a bright center, AE, yet it will shade away less rapidly into dimness because the sides, AC, AB, recede less rapidly into the fog, and what appear to me the physician's extremities, viz. D and E, will not be not so dim as the extremities of the merchant. The reader will probably understand from these 2 instances how, after a very long training supplemented by constant experience, it is possible for the well-educated classes among us to discriminate with fair accuracy between the middle and lowest orders by the sense of sight. If my Spaceland patrons have grasped this general conception, so far as to conceive the possibility of it, and not to reject my account as altogether incredible, I shall have attained all I can reasonably expect. Were I to attempt further details, I should only perplex. Yet for the sake of the young and inexperienced, who may perchance infer from the 2 simple instances I have given above of the manner in which I should recognize my father and my sons, that recognition by sight is an easy affair, it may be needful to point out that in actual life, most of the problems of sight recognition are far more subtle and complex. If, for example, when my father, the triangle, approaches me, he happens to present his side to me instead of his angle, then, until I have asked him to rotate, or until I have edged my eye round him, I am for the moment doubtful whether he may not be a straight line, or, in other words, a woman. Again, when I am in the company of one of my 2 hexagonal grandsons, contemplating one of his sides, AB full front, it will be evident from the accompanying diagram that I shall see 1 whole line, AB, in comparative brightness, shading off hardly at all at the ends, and 2 smaller lines, CA and BD, dim throughout, and shading away into greater dimness towards the extremities C and D. But I must not give way to the temptation of enlarging on these topics. The meanest mathematician in Spaceland will readily believe me when I assert that the problems of life, which present themselves to the well-educated, when they are themselves in motion, rotating, advancing or retreating, and at the same time, attempting to discriminate by the sense of sight between a number of polygons of high rank moving in different directions, as for example in a ballroom or conversazione, must be of a nature to task the angularity of the most intellectual, and, amply justify the rich endowments of the learned professors of geometry, both static and kinetic, in the illustrious University of Wentbridge, where the science and art of sight recognition are regularly taught to large classes of the elite of the states. It is only a few of the scions of our noblest and wealthiest houses who are able to give the time and money necessary for the thorough prosecution of this noble and valuable art. Even to me, a mathematician of no mean standing, and the grandfather of two most hopeful and perfectly regular hexagons, to find myself in the midst of a crowd of rotating polygons of the higher classes is occasionally very perplexing, and of course to a common tradesman or serf, such a sight is almost as unintelligible as it would be to you, my reader, were you suddenly transported into our country. In such a crowd you could see on all sides of you nothing but a line, apparently straight, but of which the parts would vary irregularly and perpetually in brightness or dimness. Even if you had completed your third year in the pentagonal and hexagonal classes in the university and were perfect in the theory of the subject, you would still find that there was need of many years of experience before you could move in. A fashionable crowd without jostling against your betters, whom it is against etiquette to ask to feel, and who, by their superior culture and breeding, know all about your movements, while you know very little or nothing about theirs. In a word, to comport oneself with perfect propriety in polygonal society, one ought to be a polygon oneself. Such at least is the painful teaching of my experience. It is astonishing how much the art, or I may almost call it instinct, of sight recognition is developed by the habitual practice of it and by the avoidance of the custom of feeling. Just as, with you, the deaf and dumb, if once allowed to gesticulate and to use the hand alphabet, will never acquire the more difficult, but far more valuable art of lip speech and lip reading. So it is with us as regards seeing and feeling. None who in early life resort to feeling will ever learn seeing in perfection. For this reason, among our higher classes, feeling is discouraged or absolutely forbidden. From the cradle, their children, instead of going to the public elementary schools, where the art of feeling is taught, are sent to higher seminaries of an exclusive character. And at our illustrious university, to feel is regarded as a most serious fault, involving rustication for the first offense and expulsion for the second. But among the lower classes, the art of sight recognition is regarded as an unattainable luxury. A common tradesman cannot afford to let his son spend a third of his life in abstract studies. The children of the poor are therefore allowed to feel from their earliest years, and they gain thereby a precocity and an early vivacity which contrast at first most favorably with the inert, undeveloped, and listless behavior of the half-instructed youths of the polygonal class. But when the latter have at last completed their university course and are prepared to put their theory into practice, the change that comes over them may almost be described as a new birth, and in every art, science, and social pursuit they rapidly overtake and distance their triangular competitors. Only a few of the polygonal class fail to pass the final test or leaving examination at the university. The condition of the unsuccessful minority is truly pitiable. Rejected from the higher class, they are also despised by the lower. They have neither the matured and systematically trained powers of the polygonal bachelors and masters of arts, nor yet the native precocity and mercurial versatility of the youthful tradesmen. The professions, the public services, are closed against them. And though in most states they are not actually debarred from marriage, yet they have the greatest difficulty in forming suitable alliances, as experience shows that the offspring of such unfortunate and ill-endowed parents is generally itself unfortunate, if not positively irregular. It is from these specimens of the refuse of our nobility that the great tumults and seditions of past ages have generally derived their leaders. And so great is the mischief thence arising, that an increasing minority of our more progressive statesmen are of opinion that true mercy would dictate their entire suppression, by enacting that all who fail to pass the final examination of the university should be either imprisoned for life or extinguished by a painless death. But I find myself digressing into the subject of irregularities, a matter of such vital interest that it demands a separate section. Section 7. Concerning irregular figures, throughout the previous pages I have been assuming, what perhaps should have been laid down at the beginning as a distinct and fundamental proposition, that every human being in Flatland is a regular figure, that is to say, of regular construction. By this I mean that a woman must not only be a line, but a straight line, that an artisan or soldier must have 2 of his sides equal, that tradesmen must have 3 sides equal, lawyers, of which class I am a humble member, 4 sides equal, and generally, that in every polygon all the sides must be equal. The size of the sides would of course depend upon the age of the individual. A female at birth would be about an inch long, while a tall adult woman might extend to a foot. As to the males of every class, it may be roughly said that the length of an adult's sides, when added together, is 2 feet or a little more. But the size of our sides is not under consideration. I am speaking of the equality of sides, and it does not need much reflection to see that the whole of the social life in Flatland rests upon the fundamental fact that nature wills all figures to have their sides equal. If our sides were unequal, our angles might be unequal. Instead of its being sufficient to feel or estimate by sight a single angle in order to determine the form of an individual, it would be necessary to ascertain each angle by the experiment of feeling. But life would be too short for such a tedious grouping. The whole science and art of sight recognition would at once perish. Feeling, so far as it is an art, would not long survive. Intercourse would become perilous or impossible. There would be an end to all confidence, all forethought. No one would be safe in making the most simple social arrangements. In a word, civilization would relapse into barbarism. Am I going too fast to carry my readers with me to these obvious conclusions? Surely a moment's reflection, and a single instance from common life, must convince everyone that our whole social system is based upon regularity, or equality of angles. You meet, for example, 2 or 3 tradesmen in the street, whom you recognize at once to be tradesmen by a glance at their angles and rapidly bedimmed sides, and you ask them to step into your house to lunch. This you do at present with perfect confidence, because everyone knows to an inch or 2 the area occupied by an adult triangle. But imagine that your tradesman drags behind his regular and respectable vertex a parallelogram of 12 or 13 inches in diagonal. What are you to do with such a monster sticking fast in your house door? But I am insulting the intelligence of my readers by accumulating details which must be patent to everyone who enjoys the advantages of a residence in Spaceland. Obviously, the measurements of a single angle would no longer be sufficient under such portentous circumstances. One's whole life would be taken up in feeling or surveying the perimeter of one's acquaintances. Already the difficulties of avoiding a collision in a crowd are enough to tax the sagacity of even a well-educated square. But if no one could calculate the regularity of a single figure in the company, all would be chaos and confusion, and the slightest panic would cause serious injuries. Or, if there happened to be any women or soldiers present, perhaps considerable loss of life. Expediency therefore concurs with nature in stamping the seal of its approval upon regularity of conformation, nor has the law been backward in seconding their efforts. Irregularity of figure means with us the same as, or more than, a combination of moral obliquity and criminality with you, and is treated accordingly. There are not wanting, it is true, some promulgators of paradoxes who maintain that there is no necessary connection between geometrical and moral irregularity. The irregular, they say, is from his birth scouted by his own parents, derided by his brothers and sisters, neglected by the domestics, scorned and suspected by society, and excluded from all posts of responsibility, trust, and useful activity. His every movement is jealously watched by the police till he comes of age and presents himself for inspection. Then he is either destroyed if he is found to exceed the fixed margin of deviation, or else immured in a government office as a clerk of the 7th class, prevented from marriage, forced to drudge at an uninteresting occupation for a miserable stipend, obliged to live and board at the office and to take even his vacation under close supervision. What wonder that human nature, even in the best and purest, is embittered and perverted by such surroundings. All this very plausible reasoning does not convince me, as it has not convinced the wisest of our statesmen, that our ancestors erred in laying it down as an axiom of policy that the Toleration of irregularity is incompatible with the safety of the state. Doubtless, the life of an irregular is hard, but the interests of the greater number require that it shall be hard. If a man with a triangular front and a polygonal back were allowed to exist and to propagate a still more irregular posterity, what would become of the arts of life? Are the houses and doors and churches in Flatland to be altered in order to accommodate such monsters? Are our ticket collectors to be required to measure every man's perimeter before they allow him to enter a theater or to take his place in a lecture room? Is an irregular to be exempted from the militia? And if not, how is he to be prevented from carrying desolation into the ranks of his comrades? Again, what irresistible temptations to fraudulent impostures must needs beset such a creature? How easy for him to enter a shop with his polygonal front foremost, and to order goods to any extent from a confiding tradesman. Let the advocates of a falsely called philanthropy plead as they may for the abrogation of the irregular penal laws. I, for my part, have never known an irregular who was not also what nature evidently intended him to be, a hypocrite, a misanthropist, and up to the limits of his power, a perpetrator of all manner of mischief. Not that I should be disposed to recommend, at present, the extreme measures adopted by some states, where an infant whose angle deviates by half a degree from the correct angularity is summarily destroyed at birth. Some of our highest and ablest men of real genius, have during their earliest days labored under deviations as great as, or even greater than, 45 minutes, and the loss of their precious lives would have been an irreparable injury to the state. The art of healing also has achieved some of its most glorious triumphs in the compressions, extensions, trepannings, colligations, and other surgical or dietetic operations by which irregularity has been partly or wholly cured. Advocating, therefore, a via media, I would lay down no fixed or absolute line of demarcation, but at the period when the frame is just beginning to set, and when the medical board has reported that recovery is improbable, I would suggest that the irregular offspring be painlessly and mercifully consumed. Section 8. Of the ancient practice of painting. If my readers have followed me with any attention up to this point, they will not be surprised to hear that life is somewhat dull in Flatland. I do not, of course, mean that there are not battles, conspiracies, tumults, factions, and all those other phenomena which are supposed to make history interesting, nor would I deny that the strange mixture of the problems of life and the problems of mathematics, continually inducing conjecture, and giving the opportunity of immediate verification, imparts to our existence a zest which you in Spaceland can hardly comprehend. I speak now from the aesthetic and artistic point of view when I say that life with us is dull. Aesthetically and artistically, very dull indeed. How can it be otherwise when all one's prospect, all one's landscapes, historical pieces, portraits, flowers, still life, are nothing but a single line, with no varieties except degrees of brightness and obscurity? It was not always thus. Color, if tradition speaks the truth, once for the space of half a dozen centuries or more, threw a transient splendor over the lives of our ancestors in the remotest ages. Some private individual, a Pentagon whose name is variously reported, having casually discovered the constituents of the simpler colors and a rudimentary method of painting, is said to have begun decorating first his house, then his slaves, then his father, his sons and grandsons, lastly himself. The convenience as well as the beauty of the results commended themselves to all. Wherever chromatists, for by that name the most trustworthy authorities concur in calling him, turned his variegated frame, there he at once excited attention and attracted respect. No one now needed to feel him, no one mistook his front for his back. All his movements were readily ascertained by his neighbors without the slightest strain on their powers of calculation. No one jostled him or failed to make way for him. His voice was saved the labor of that exhausting utterance by which we colorless squares and pentagons are often forced to proclaim our individuality when we move amid a crowd of ignorant isosceles. The fashion spread like wildfire. Before a week was over, every square and triangle in the district had copied the example of chromatistes, and only a few of the more conservative pentagons still held out. A month or two found even the dodecagons infected with the innovation. A year had not elapsed before the habit had spread to all but the very highest of the nobility. Needless to say, the custom soon made its way from the district of Chromatistas to surrounding regions, and within 2 generations, no one in all Flatland was colorless, except the women and the priests. Here nature herself appeared to erect a barrier and to plead against extending the innovation to these 2 classes. Many-sidedness was almost essential as a pretext for the innovators. Distinction of sides is intended by nature to imply distinction of colors. Such was the sophism which in those days flew from mouth to mouth, converting whole towns at a time to the new culture. But manifestly to our priests and women this adage did not apply. The latter had only one side, and therefore, plurally and pedantically speaking, no sides. The former, if at least they would assert their claim to be really and truly circles, and not mere high-class polygons with an infinitely large number of infinitesimally small sides, were in the habit of boasting, what women confessed and deplored, that they also had no sides, being blessed with a perimeter of 1 line, or in other words, a circumference. Hence it came to pass that these 2 classes could see no force in the so-called axiom about distinction of sides implying distinction of color, and when all others had succumbed to the fascinations of corporal decoration, the priests and the women alone still remained pure from the pollution of paint. Immoral, licentious, anarchical, unscientific, call them by what names you will. Yet, from an aesthetic point of view, those ancient days of the color revolt were the glorious childhood of art in Flatland. A childhood, alas, that never ripened into manhood, nor even reached the blossom of youth. To live was then in itself a delight, because living implied seeing. Even at a small party, the company was a pleasure to behold. The richly varied hues of the assembly in a church or theater are said to have more than once proved too distracting for our greatest teachers and actors. But most ravishing of all is said to have been the unspeakable magnificence of a military review. The sight of a line of battle of 20,000 isosceles suddenly facing about, and exchanging the somber black of their bases for the orange and purple of the 2 sides, including their acute angle. The militia of the equilateral triangles tricolored in red, white, and blue. The mauve, ultramarine, gamboge, and burnt umber of the square artillerymen rapidly rotating near their vermilion guns. The dashing and flashing of the 5-colored and 6-colored pentagons and hexagons careering across the field in their offices of surgeons, geometricians, and aides-de-camp. All these may well have been sufficient to render credible the famous story, how an illustrious circle, overcome by the artistic beauty of the forces under his command, threw aside his marshal's baton and his royal crown, exclaiming that he henceforth exchanged them for the artist's pencil. How great and glorious the sensuous development of these days must have been is in part indicated by the very language and vocabulary of the period. The commonest utterances of the commonest citizens in the time of the color revolt seem to have been suffused with a richer tinge of word or thought, and to that era we are even now indebted for our finest poetry, and for whatever rhythm still remains in the more scientific utterance of these modern days. Section 9. Of the universal color. Bill. But meanwhile the intellectual arts were fast decaying. The art of sight recognition, being no longer needed, was no longer practiced, and the studies of geometry, statics, kinetics, and other kindred subjects came soon to be considered superfluous and fell into disrespect and neglect even at our university. The inferior art of feeling speedily experienced the same fate at our elementary schools. Then the isosceles classes, asserting that the specimens were no longer used nor needed, and refusing to pay the customary tribute from the criminal classes to the service of education, waxed daily more numerous and more insolent on the strength of their immunity from the old burden which had formerly exercised the twofold wholesome effect of at once taming their brutal nature and thinning their excessive numbers. Year by year the soldiers and artisans began more vehemently to assert, and with increasing truth, that there was no great difference between them and the very highest class of polygons, now that they were raised to an equality with the latter, and enabled to grapple with all the difficulties and solve all the problems of life, whether statical or kinetical, by the simple process of color recognition. Not content with the natural neglect into which sight recognition was falling, They began boldly to demand the legal prohibition of all monopolizing and aristocratic arts, and the consequent abolition of all endowments for the studies of sight recognition, mathematics, and feeling. Soon they began to insist that inasmuch as color, which was a second nature, had destroyed the need of aristocratic distinctions, the law should follow in the same path, and that henceforth all individuals and all classes should be recognized as absolutely equal and entitled to equal rights. Finding the higher orders wavering and undecided, the leaders of the revolution advanced still further in their requirements, and at last demanded that all classes alike, the priests and the women, not excepted, should do homage to color by submitting to be painted. When it was objected that priests and women had no sides, they retorted that nature and expediency concurred in dictating that the front half of every human being, that is to say, the half containing his eye and mouth, should be distinguishable from his hinder half. They therefore brought before a general and extraordinary assembly of all the states of Flatland a bill proposing that in every woman the half containing the eye and mouth should be colored red and the other half green. The priests were to be painted in the same way, red being applied to that semicircle in which the eye and mouth formed the middle point, while the other or hinder semicircle was to be colored green. There was no little cunning in this proposal, which indeed emanated not from any isosceles, for no being so degraded would have had angularity enough to appreciate, much less to devise, such a model of statecraft, but from an irregular circle who, instead of being destroyed in his childhood, was reserved by a foolish indulgence to bring desolation on his country and destruction on myriads of his followers. On the one hand, the proposition was calculated to bring the women in all classes over to the side of the chromatic innovation. For by assigning to the women the same two colors as were assigned to the priests, the revolutionists thereby ensured that, in certain positions, every woman would appear like a priest and be treated with corresponding respect and deference, a prospect that could not fail to attract the female sex in a mass. But by some of my readers, the possibility of the identical appearance of priests and women under the new legislation may not be recognized. If so, a word or two will make it obvious. Imagine a woman duly decorated, according to the new code, with the front half, i.e., the half containing eye and mouth, red, and with the hinder half green. Look at her from one side. Obviously, you will see a straight line, half red, half green. Now imagine a priest whose mouth is at M, and whose front semicircle, AMB, is consequently colored red, while his hinder semicircle is green, so that the diameter AB divides the green from the red. If you contemplate the great man so as to have your eye in the same straight line as his dividing diameter, AB, what you will see will be a straight line, CBD, of which one half, CB, will be red, and the other, BD, green. The whole line, CD, will be rather shorter perhaps than that of a full-sized woman, and will shade off more rapidly towards its extremities, but the identity of the colors would give you an immediate impression of identity of class, making you neglectful of other details. Bear in mind the decay of sight recognition which threatened society at the time of the color revolt. Add to the certainty that women would speedily learn to shade off their extremities so as to imitate the circles. It must then be surely obvious to you, my dear reader, that the color bill placed us under a great danger of confounding a priest with a young woman. How attractive this prospect must have been to the frail sex may readily be imagined. They anticipated with delight the confusion that would ensue. At home they might hear political and ecclesiastical secrets intended not for them, but for their husbands and brothers, and might even issue commands in the name of a priestly circle. Out of doors, the striking combination of red and green, without addition of any other colors, would be sure to lead the common people into endless mistakes, and the women would gain whatever the circles lost in the deference of the passers-by. As for the scandal that would befall the circular class if the frivolous and unseemly conduct of the women were imputed to them, and as to the consequent subversion of the Constitution, the female sex could not be expected to give a thought to these considerations. Even in the households of the circles, the women were all in favor of the universal color bill. The second object aimed at by the bill was the gradual demoralization of the circles themselves. In the general intellectual decay they still preserved, their pristine clearness and strength of understanding. From their earliest childhood, familiarized in their circular households with the total absence of color, the nobles alone preserved the sacred art of sight recognition, with all the advantages that result from that admirable training of the intellect. Hence, up to the date of the introduction of the Universal Color Bill, the circles had not only held their own, but even increased their lead of the other classes by abstinence from the popular fashion. Now, therefore, the artful irregular whom I described above as the real author of this diabolical bill, determined at one blow to lower the status of the hierarchy by forcing them to submit to the pollution of color, and at the same time to destroy their domestic opportunities of training in the art of sight recognition, so as to enfeeble their intellects by depriving them of their pure and colorless homes. Once subjected to the chromatic taint, every parental and every childish circle would demoralize each other. Only in discerning between the father and the mother would the circular infant find problems for the exercise of its understanding. Problems too often likely to be corrupted by maternal impostures, with the result of shaking the child's faith in all logical conclusions. Thus, by degrees, the intellectual luster of the priestly order would wane, and the road would then lie open for a total destruction of all aristocratic legislature and for the subversion of our privileged classes. Section 10. Of the suppression of the chromatic sedition. The agitation for the Universal Color Bill continued for 3 years, and up to the last moment of that period, it seemed as though anarchy were destined to triumph. A whole army of polygons, who turned out to fight as private soldiers, was utterly annihilated by a superior force of isosceles triangles, the squares and pentagons meanwhile remaining neutral. Worse than all, some of the ablest circles fell a prey to conjugal fury. Infuriated by political animosity, the wives in many a noble household wearied their lords with prayers to give up their opposition to the color bill, and some, finding their entreaties fruitless, fell on and slaughtered their innocent children and husband, perishing themselves in the act of carnage. It is recorded that during that triennial agitation no less than 23 circles perished in domestic discord. Great indeed was the peril. It seemed as though the priests had no choice between submission and extermination, when suddenly the course of events was completely changed by one of those picturesque incidents which statesmen ought never to neglect, often to anticipate, and sometimes perhaps to originate, because of the absurdly disproportionate power with which they appeal to the sympathies of the populace. It happened that an isosceles of a low type, with a brain little if at all above 4 degrees, accidentally dabbling in the colors of some tradesman whose shop he had plundered, painted himself, or caused himself to be painted, for the story varies, with the 12 colors of a dodecagon. Going into the marketplace, he accosted in a feigned voice a maiden, the orphan daughter of a noble polygon, whose affection in former days he had sought in vain, and by a series of deceptions, aided on the one side by a string of lucky accidents too long to relate, and on the other, by an almost inconceivable fatuity and neglect of ordinary precautions on the part of the relations of the bride, he succeeded in consummating the marriage. The unhappy girl committed suicide on discovering the fraud to which she had been subjected. When the news of this catastrophe spread from state to state, the minds of the women were violently agitated. Sympathy with the miserable victim, and anticipations of similar deceptions for themselves, their sisters, and their daughters, made them now regard the color bill in an entirely new aspect. Not a few openly avowed themselves converted to antagonism. The rest needed only a slight stimulus to make a similar avowal. Seizing this favorable opportunity, the circles hastily convened an extraordinary assembly of the states, and besides the usual guard of convicts, they secured the attendance of a large number of reactionary women. Amidst an unprecedented concourse, the chief circle of those days, by name Pantocyclus, arose to find himself hissed and hooted by 120,000 isosceles. But he secured silence by declaring that henceforth the circles would enter on a policy of concession, yielding to the wishes of the majority, they would accept the color bill. The uproar being at once converted to applause, he invited chromatists, the leader of the sedition, into the center of the hall, to receive in the name of his followers the submission of the hierarchy. Then followed a speech, a masterpiece of rhetoric, which occupied nearly a day in the delivery, and to which no summary can do justice. With a grave appearance of impartiality, he declared that as they were now finally committing themselves to reform or innovation, it was desirable that they should take one last view of the perimeter of the whole subject, its defects as well as its advantages. Gradually introducing the mention of the dangers to the tradesmen, the professional classes, and the gentlemen, he silenced the rising murmurs of the isosceles by reminding them that, in spite of all these defects, he was willing to accept the bill if it was approved by the majority. But it was manifest that all, except the isosceles, were moved by his words and were either neutral or averse to the bill. Turning now to the workmen, he asserted that their interests must not be neglected, and that if they intended to accept the color bill, they ought at least to do so with full view of the consequences. Many of them, he said, were on the point of being admitted to the class of the regular triangles. Others anticipated for their children a distinction they could not hope for themselves. That honorable ambition would now have to be sacrificed. With the universal adoption of color, all distinctions would cease. Regularity would be confused with irregularity. Development would give place to retrogression. The workman would, in a few generations, be degraded to the level of the military, or even the convict class. Political power would be in the hands of the greatest number, that is to say, the criminal classes, who were already more numerous than the workmen, and would soon outnumber all the other classes put together when the usual compensative laws of nature were violated. A subdued murmur of assent ran through the ranks of the artisans, and chromatistes, in alarm, attempted to step forward and address them. But he found himself encompassed with guards and forced to remain silent while the chief circle, in a few impassioned words, made a final appeal to the women, exclaiming that, if the color bill passed, no marriage would henceforth be safe. No, woman's honor secure. Fraud, deception, hypocrisy would pervade every household. Domestic bliss would share the fate of the Constitution and pass to speedy perdition. Sooner than this, he cried, come death. At these words, which were the preconcerted signal for action, the isosceles convicts fell on and transfixed the wretched chromatistes. The regular classes, opening their ranks, made way for a band of women who, under direction of the circles, moved back foremost, invisibly and unerringly upon the unconscious soldiers. The artisans, imitating the example of their betters, also opened their ranks. Meantime, bands of convicts occupied every entrance with an impenetrable phalanx. The battle, or rather carnage, was of short duration. Under the skillful generalship of the circles, almost every woman's charge was fatal, and very many extracted their sting uninjured, ready for a second slaughter. But no second blow was needed. The rabble of the isosceles did the rest of the business for themselves. Surprised, leaderless, attacked in front by invisible foes, and finding egress cut off by the convicts behind them, they at once, after their manner, lost all presence of mind and raised the cry of treachery. This sealed their fate. Every isosceles now saw and felt a foe in every other. In half an hour, not one of that vast multitude was living, and the fragments of 70,000 of the criminal class slain by one another's angles attested the triumph of order. The circles delayed not to push their victory to the uttermost. The working men they spared but decimated. The militia of the equilaterals was at once called out, and every triangle suspected of irregularity on reasonable grounds was destroyed by court-martial without the formality of exact measurement. By the social board, the homes of the military and artisan classes were inspected in a course of visitations extending through upwards of a year, and during that period every town, village, and hamlet was systematically purged of that excess of the lower orders which had been brought about by the neglect to pay the tribute of criminals to the schools and university, and by the violation of the other natural laws of the Constitution of Flatland. Thus the balance of classes was again restored. Needless to say that henceforth the use of color was abolished and its possession prohibited. Even the utterance of any word denoting color, except by the circles or by qualified scientific teachers, was punished by a severe penalty. Only at our university in some of the very highest and most esoteric classes, which I myself have never been privileged to attend, It is understood that the sparing use of color is still sanctioned for the purpose of illustrating some of the deeper problems of mathematics, but of this I can only speak from hearsay. Elsewhere in Flatland, color is now non-existent. The art of making it is known to only one living person, the chief circle for the time being, and by him it is handed down on his deathbed to none but his successor. One manufactory alone produces it, and lest the secret should be betrayed, the workmen are annually consumed and fresh ones introduced. So great is the terror with which even now our aristocracy looks back to the far distant days of the agitation for the universal color bill. Section 11. Concerning our priests, it is high time that I should pass from these brief and discursive notes about things in Flatland to the central event of this book, my initiation into the mysteries of space. That is my subject. All that has gone before is merely preface. For this reason, I must omit many matters of which the explanation would not, I flatter myself, be without interest for my readers. As for example, our method of propelling and stopping ourselves, although destitute of feet. The means by which we give fixity to structures of wood, stone, or brick, although of course we have no hands, nor can we lay foundations as you can, nor avail ourselves of the lateral pressure of the earth. The manner in which the rain originates, in the intervals between our various zones, so that the northern regions do not intercept the moisture from falling on the southern. The nature of our hills and mines, our trees and vegetables, our seasons and harvests. Our alphabet and method of writing, adapted to our linear tablets. These and 100 other details of our physical existence I must pass over. Nor do I mention them now except to indicate to my readers that their omission proceeds not from forgetfulness on the part of the author, but from his regard for the time of the reader. Yet before I proceed to my legitimate subject, some few final remarks will, no doubt, be expected by my readers upon those pillars and mainstays of the Constitution of Flatland, the controllers of our conduct and shapers of our destiny, the objects of universal homage and almost of adoration. Need I say that I mean our circles or priests? When I call them priests, let me not be understood as meaning no more than the term denotes with you. With us, our priests are administrators of all business, art, and science, directors of trade, commerce, generalship, architecture, engineering, education, statesmanship, legislature, morality, theology. Doing nothing themselves, they are the causes of everything worth doing that is done by others. Although popularly, everyone called a circle is deemed a circle, yet among the better educated classes it is known that no circle is really a circle, but only a polygon with a very large number of very small sides. As the number of the sides increases, a polygon approximates to a circle, and when the number is very great indeed, say for example 300 or 400, it is extremely difficult for the most delicate touch to feel any polygonal angles. Let me say rather, it would be difficult, for, as I have shown above, recognition by feeling is unknown among the highest society, and to feel a circle would be considered a most audacious insult. This habit of abstention from feeling in the best society enables a circle the more easily to sustain the veil of mystery in which, from his earliest years, he is wont to enwrap the exact nature of his perimeter or circumference. 3 feet. Being the average perimeter, it follows that, in a polygon of 300 sides, each side will be no more than the 100th part of a foot in length, or little more than the 10th part of an inch. And in a polygon of 600 or 700 sides, the sides are little larger than the diameter of a Spaceland pinhead. It is always assumed, by courtesy, that the chief circle for the time being has 10,000 sides. The ascent of the posterity of the circles in the social scale is not restricted, as it is among the lower regular classes, by the law of nature which limits the increase of sides to 1 in each generation. If it were so, the number of sides in a circle would be a mere question of pedigree and arithmetic, and the 497th descendant of an equilateral triangle would necessarily be a polygon with 500 sides. But this is not the case. Nature's law prescribes 2 antagonistic decrees affecting circular propagation. First, that as the race climbs higher in the scale of development, so development shall proceed at an accelerated pace. Second, that in the same proportion, the race shall become less fertile. Consequently, in the home of a polygon of 400 or 500 sides, it is rare to find a sun. More than one is never seen. On the other hand, the sun of a 500-sided polygon has been known to possess 550 or even 600 sides. Art also steps in to help the process of the higher evolution. Our physicians have discovered that the small and tender sides of an infant polygon of the higher class can be fractured and his whole frame reset with such exactness that a polygon of 200 or 300 sides sometimes, by no means always, for the process is attended with serious risk, but sometimes overleaps 200 or 300 generations, and as it were doubles at a stroke the number of his progenitors and the nobility of his descent. Many a promising child is sacrificed in this way. Scarcely 1 out of 10 survives. Yet so strong is the parental ambition among those polygons who are, as it were, on the fringe of the circular class, that it is very rare to find a nobleman of that position in society who has neglected to place his firstborn in the circular neo-therapeutic gymnasium before he has attained the age of a month. 1 year determines success or failure. At the end of that time, the child has, in all probability, added 1 more to the tombstones that crowd the neo-therapeutic cemetery. But on rare occasions, a glad procession bears back the little one to his exultant parents, no longer a polygon, but a circle, at least by courtesy, and a single instance of so blessed a result induces multitudes of polygonal parents to submit to similar domestic sacrifices, which have a dissimilar issue. Section 12. Of the doctrine of our priests, as to the doctrine of the circles, it may briefly be summed up in a single maxim: attend to your configuration. Whether political, ecclesiastical, or moral, all their teaching has for its object the improvement of individual and collective configuration, with special reference, of course, to the configuration of the circles, to which all other objects are subordinated. It is the merit of the circles that they have effectually suppressed those ancient heresies which led men to waste energy and sympathy in the vain belief that conduct depends upon will, effort, training, encouragement, praise, or anything else but configuration. It was Pantacyclus, the illustrious circle mentioned above as the queller of the color revolt, who first convinced mankind that configuration makes the man, that if, for example, you are born an isosceles with 2 uneven sides, you will assuredly go wrong unless you have them made even, for which purpose you must go to the isosceles hospital. Similarly, if you are a triangle, or square, or even a polygon, born with any irregularity, you must be taken to one of the regular hospitals to have your disease cured. Otherwise, you will end your days in the state prison, or by the angle of the state executioner. All faults or defects, from the slightest misconduct to the most flagitious crime, Pantacyclus attributed to some deviation from perfect regularity in the bodily figure, caused perhaps, if not congenital, by some collision in a crowd, by neglect to take exercise, or by taking too much of it, or even by a sudden change of temperature, resulting in a shrinkage or expansion in some too susceptible part of the frame. Therefore, concluded that illustrious philosopher, neither good conduct nor bad conduct is a fit subject, in any sober estimation, for either praise or blame. For why should you praise, for example, the integrity of a square who faithfully defends the interests of his client, when you ought in reality rather to admire the exact precision of his right angles? Or again, why blame a lying, thievish isosceles when you ought rather to deplore the incurable inequality of his sides? Theoretically, this doctrine is unquestionable, but it has practical drawbacks. In dealing with an isosceles, if a rascal pleads that he cannot help stealing because of his unevenness, you reply that for that very reason, because he cannot help being a nuisance to his neighbors, you, the magistrate, cannot help sentencing him to be consumed, and there's an end of the matter. But in little domestic difficulties, where the penalty of consumption or death is out of the question, this theory of configuration sometimes comes in awkwardly, and I must confess that occasionally when one of my own hexagonal grandsons pleads as an excuse for his disobedience that a sudden change of the temperature has been too much for his perimeter, and that I ought to lay the blame not on him but on his configuration, which can only be strengthened by abundance of the choicest sweetmeats, I neither see my way logically to reject nor practically to accept his conclusions. For my own part, I find it best to assume that a good sound scolding or castigation has some latent and strengthening influence on my grandson's configuration, though I own that I have no grounds for thinking so. At all events, I am not alone in my way of extricating myself from this dilemma, for I find that many of the highest circles, sitting as judges in law courts, use praise and blame towards regular and irregular figures. And in their homes, I know by experience that, when scolding their children, they speak about right or wrong, as vehemently and passionately as if they believed that these names represented real existences, and that a human figure is really capable of choosing between them, constantly carrying out their policy of making configuration the leading idea in every mind. The circles reverse the nature of that commandment, which in Spaceland regulates the relations between parents and children. With you, children are taught to honor their parents. With us, next to the circles, who are the chief object of universal homage, a man is taught to honor his grandson, if he has one, or, if not, his son. By honor, however, is by no means meant indulgence, but a reverent regard for their highest interests, and the circles teach that the duty of fathers is to subordinate their own interests to those of posterity, thereby advancing the welfare of the whole state as well as that of their own immediate descendants. The weak point in the system of the circles, if a humble square may venture to speak of anything circular as containing any element of weakness, appears to me to be found in their relations with women. As it is of the utmost importance for society that irregular births should be discouraged, it follows that no woman who has any irregularities in her ancestry is a fit partner for one who desires that his posterity should rise by regular degrees in the social scale. Now, the irregularity of a male is a matter of measurement, but as all women are straight, and therefore visibly regular, so to speak, one has to devise some other means of ascertaining what I may call their invisible irregularity, that is to say, their potential irregularities as regards possible offspring. This is effected by carefully kept pedigrees, which are preserved and supervised by the state, and without a certified pedigree, no woman is allowed to marry. Now, it might have been supposed that a circle, proud of his ancestry and regardful for a posterity which might possibly issue hereafter in a chief circle, would be more careful than any other to choose a wife who had no blot on her escutcheon. But it is not so. The care in choosing a regular wife appears to diminish as one rises. In the social scale, nothing would induce an aspiring isosceles, who had hopes of generating an equilateral son, to take a wife who reckoned a single irregularity among her ancestors. A square or pentagon, who is confident that his family is steadily on the rise, does not inquire above the 500th generation. A hexagon or dodecagon is even more careless of the wife's pedigree. But a circle has been known deliberately to take a wife who has had an irregular great-grandfather, and all because of some slight superiority of luster, or because of the charms of a low voice, which, with us, even more than you, is thought an excellent thing in woman. Such ill-judged marriages are, as might be expected, barren if they do not result in positive irregularity or in diminution of sides. But none of these evils have hitherto proved sufficiently deterrent. The loss of a few sides in a highly developed polygon is not easily noticed, and is sometimes compensated by a successful operation in the neo-therapeutic gymnasium, as I have described above, and the circles are too much disposed to acquiesce in infecundity as a law of the superior development. Yet, if this evil be not arrested, the gradual diminution of the circular class may soon become more rapid, and the time may be not far distant when, the race being no longer able to produce a chief circle, the constitution of Flatland must fall. 1. Other word of warning suggests itself to me, though I cannot so easily mention a remedy, and this also refers to our relations with women. About 300 years ago, it was decreed by the chief circle that, since women are deficient in reason, but abundant in emotion, they ought no longer to be treated as rational, nor receive any mental education. The consequence was that they were no longer taught to read, nor even to master arithmetic enough to enable them to count the angles of their husband or children, and hence they sensibly declined during each generation in intellectual power. And this system of female non-education or quietism still prevails. My fear is that, with the best intentions, This policy has been carried so far as to react injuriously on the male sex. For the consequence is that, as things now are, we males have to lead a kind of bilingual, and I may almost say bimental existence. With women we speak of love, duty, right, wrong, pity, hope, and other irrational and emotional conceptions which have no existence, and the fiction of which has no object except to control feminine exuberances. But among ourselves and in our books, we have an entirely different vocabulary, and I may almost say, idiom. Love then becomes the anticipation of benefits. Duty becomes necessity, or fitness, and other words are correspondingly transmuted. Moreover, among women, we use language implying the utmost deference for their sex, and they fully believe that the chief circle himself is not more devoutly adored by us than they are. But behind their backs, they are both regarded and spoken of by all except the very young as being little better than mindless organisms. Our theology also in the women's chambers is entirely different from our theology elsewhere. Now my humble fear is that this double training, in language as well as in thought, imposes somewhat too heavy a burden upon the young, especially when, at the age of 3 years old, they are taken from the maternal care and taught to unlearn the old language, except for the purpose of repeating it in the presence of their mothers and nurses, and to learn the vocabulary and idiom of science. Already methinks I discern a weakness in the grasp of mathematical truth at the present time as compared with the more robust intellect of our ancestors 300 years ago. I say nothing of the possible danger if a woman should ever surreptitiously learn to read and convey to her sex the result of her perusal of a single popular volume, nor of the possibility that the indiscretion or disobedience of some infant male might reveal to a mother the secrets of the logical dialect. On the simple ground of the enfeebling of the male intellect, I rest this humble appeal to the highest authorities to reconsider the regulations of female education.